Stanford University.
I'm going to kind of set the stage, give a little of the big picture background, and then Jenny will talk about a lot of the details, building on the really outstanding workshop that we had earlier this year, late last year, not that long ago. The idea of these Energy 101 sessions is that we're really trying to have a dialogue and to make sure that your questions get answered. So we have some slides, but people should feel free to weigh in as they feel appropriate, make sure that if things are unclear, you ask questions and encourage us to go more deeply into topics that you're most interested in. The basic background of the idea of negative emissions energy systems connects deeply with my work, trying to understand climate change impacts, and it connects deeply with the question of where we headed in our efforts to get greenhouse gases under control. And the answer is that we're not doing everything we should to get greenhouse gases under control. The whole motivation for the GCEP project is to try and come up with the technologies to do that, but there's a time component. And what many people, including me, think is that if we look at the pace at which we're moving away from fossil energy, what we're seeing is that pace being too slow to keep us at the 2-degree target that's been agreed by the world's governments. And it's too slow to avoid what Article 2 of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change calls dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. So what are our options? And the one option is to work harder on decreasing emission rates, and that's kind of the core of the GCEP agenda. Another option is to find ways to look at technologies for removing CO2 from the atmosphere. And there are a couple of motivations for this. One is that it potentially allows us to address some of the problems that we're creating now. And another is that it, at least in principle, allows us to be more creative about a range of energy solutions. And so what we want to talk about is what's the general background of where we are with carbon emissions, why there's so much priority on decreasing emissions, and how failure to address that priority in an aggressive enough way creates a growing need to come up with additional approaches, and one of those approaches might be energy systems that deliver energy into the grid at the same time they remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So just in terms of the background, I want to talk about 5 things that you probably all know about, but they're really the foundation for consideration of any kind of new energy technologies, but especially negative emissions technologies. So the first is emissions of greenhouse gases are still increasing rapidly. They've actually been increasingly more rapidly since 2000 than in any time prior to that. We have an increasing appreciation of the way that CO2 alters climate and of the long duration of the climate impacts of CO2. We also have an increasing appreciation of the wide range of consequences of climate change. Much of my work over the last several years has been focused on understanding the relationship between climate change and risks of extremes and disasters. And I think at least for most Americans, the way that climate change gets perceived is through extreme events. And so it's really important to build that into the agenda as we consider climate change. Ocean acidification is really important for a number of reasons. One, it's running in parallel with climate change. It also is a direct consequence of atmospheric CO2, and one that is independent of the sensitivity of climate to CO2. And then once we get through these things in terms of background, the details of the negative emissions technologies are things that Jenny will speak with you about. Just so that people are aware of the terminology and the conventions, the atmosphere currently has about 400 parts per million of CO2, as you know. Given the mass of the atmosphere, 1 part per million of CO2 translates into about 2 billion tons of carbon, 2 gigatons of carbon. And we often in the scientific community talk in terms of emissions in units of carbon. In the treaty world and in most of the business world, people talk in terms of units of CO2 because oxygen weighs more than carbon and you get 2 oxygens in each CO2. One unit of carbon translates to 3.66 units of CO2. So 1 billion tons of carbon is 3.66 billion tons of CO2. Just so we're clear on the units, giga is a 10 to the 9th or a billion. Peta is 10 to the 15th, and I apologize, I may slip back and forth between gigaton, a billion tons, and a petagram, 10 to the 15th grams, and if you do your math real quick, you'll realize that those are the same thing. So we'll talk in terms of billions of tons of, most of my comments are going to be billions of tons of carbon, and you can remember that 3.66 to convert them to billions of tons of CO2. Here's the trajectory of CO2 emissions over the last 20 years or so. Actual emissions are shown in the black, and you can see that they've been rising rapidly. They're rising rapidly through the entire period, but especially rapidly since 2000. One of the things we learned in a frustrating way is that there is a way to decrease CO2 emissions on a year-to-year basis, and it's to have a global economic collapse. That's what you saw from 2008 to 2009. That's not what we want to do. What we want to do in the energy and environment space is find ways to create growing, vibrant economies at the same time we're decreasing CO2 emissions. And it's a little bit hard to see here, but if you follow the trajectory of CO2 emissions since 2009, what we saw is that we didn't return to the initial rate of growth, we actually returned to the initial trajectory. So this 2010 number, this is an estimate here, but the actual number was higher. And if you look at the going from 2007 to 2008, if you assume that 2009 would have been a normal year and then go to 2010, it looks as if the economic downturn actually had no effect on the long-term trajectory. When you put this in the context of the full range of scenarios that we've explored with climate models in the IPCC, what you find is that the trajectory of CO2 growth over the last 20 years or so has tracked right along with the highest of the emissions scenarios. What's characterized here in the old scenarios, A1 FI for fossil intensive, is a very rapidly growing industrialized world with CO2 emissions that were envisioned as higher than were likely with any kind of a reasonable scenario when these were defined back in 2000. And what you can see is that through most of the last 20 years, we've really grown at an emissions trajectory which has been right along this highest line. Going from 2011 to 2012, the annual increase in CO2 emissions was about 3% at the global scale, even though important countries, the US and the European Union, both had emissions decreases during that period. What it really demonstrates is now we're in an emissions environment that's increasingly dominated by emissions growth in rapidly industrializing parts of the world. Year on year, China and India have both been growing between 5 and 10% over the last decade. And one of the truly sobering components of the most recently released global carbon budget, the 2012 budget, is that for the 2012 total emissions, China's emissions are equal to just about the sum of the US and Europe. As of 2005, China was not the biggest emitter. As of the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, we really thought that if we could get the emissions of the developed countries under control, we really had many decades before we needed to worry about emissions of the developing countries. And I think that the phenomenally rapid industrialization in China and India has it's really changed the game in some important ways, and in ways that increase the motivation for a focus on negative emissions. Here are the set of trajectories, scenarios. These are possible futures that we've explored in the most recent IPCC report, and they go from a world with aggressive continued utilization of fossil-based resources for this it's called RCP, Representative Concentration Pathway 8.5, which you can see as the top, resulting in end of century CO2 emissions of about 100 billion tons, about 25 billion tons of carbon. Pathways that involve a little bit of mitigation at 6 watts per meter squared, quite a lot of mitigation at 4.5 watts per meter squared, and then aggressive mitigation to get emissions down so that the total forcing of climate at the end of the century is on the order of 3 watts or less per meter squared. One of the things that's really dramatic is that if we look at the climate model scenarios and say, well, which of these emission scenarios get us below a 2-degree target, the only one that does consistently is this less than 3 watts per meter squared. About only a third of the RCP 4.5 scenarios runs get you less than 2 degrees. All of the 6 and all of the 8.5 are substantially above that. And then a final sobering component of these very aggressive mitigation scenarios is that you can see, especially with this one for the 2.6 watts per meter squared of total forcing at the end of the century, is that this emissions trajectory passes from positive emissions to negative emissions about 2070. So what that says is not that we have a peak and decline at 2070, but we actually go on a net global basis from positive emissions to the atmosphere to negative emissions at about 2070, and that's the only scenario that consistently gets us below the 2-degree target that's set by the world's leaders. Incredibly challenging to figure out how to get down to 0, but then to push below 0, you really need the topic of this workshop, negative emissions. Where do emissions come from? I suspect that most people know this, but you know, if you look at where emissions come from, it comes more or less in a balanced way from transportation, making things, residential buildings, and commercial buildings. And one really nice analysis that was published a couple of years ago by some of my colleagues at Carnegie said, well, how many emissions are we committed to just as a consequence of the stuff we have now? We've got a lot of vehicles on the road, we've got power plants. Let's just say we let those live out their design lives. Where are we in terms of atmospheric CO2? And they did it both by energy sector and by country. You can see that when you do it by energy sector, it's primary energy. This is basically power plants that are the biggest contributor, and they also are very long-lasting. So an a coal-fired power plant that's built in 2013 would be scheduled to be taken offline in 2060. Remember, I'm talking about net zero emissions from the global economy in 2070. So we really have a big problem if we're looking about deploying new infrastructure. And in fact, if you look at the existing stock of infrastructure and just let it live out its life, we're talking about, you know, life expectancies that end out in the 2050 time frame. If you look at energy technologies on a country-by-country basis, you see another really challenging phenomenon. Look at the U.S. here in blue. You can see that we have a kind of an even-aged mix of energy infrastructure, so that every year we're building new infrastructure, but we're retiring infrastructure at the same time. If you look in contrast at China here, the big purple one at the bottom, most of the energy infrastructure in China is essentially new, and very little is being retired on a year-on-year basis. That's why this wedge in the plot is flat over many years. Essentially, none of the existing technology gets retired until we get out into the 2040 timeframe. However, one piece of good news based on this analysis is if you say, okay, let's add up across all of these energy technologies, you come up to these CO2 concentrations, and the consequences of letting the existing infrastructure live out its entire life is that we don't end up with CO2 concentrations that are raised that much above current levels, maybe in the order of 410 to 420 parts per million as a consequence of letting the existing technology live out its design life. The really great news feature of that is that what it means is that we really have control over the rate of CO2 increase beyond this approximately 420 parts per million. The extent to which we hit CO2 concentrations higher than that depends on infrastructure that we haven't built yet. The challenge is that we're planning on building it in the current economic landscape, and if we're not going to go to CO2 concentrations that are up in the range that's causing warming way above the 2 degree threshold, then we need some way to come up with the technologies to not build the new technology, to not build the fossil emitting technology that will continue the emissions. I'm going to talk just a couple of minutes about ocean acidification, and the main reason I want to talk about ocean acidification in parallel to the climate change is that there's a kind of a parallel agenda that's going on in the broader climate community that is concerned with the idea that we might be able to mask or offset effects of climate change by releasing heat reflecting compounds into the atmosphere. It's called solar radiation management or geoengineering. And that's an important research area. I think it's too early to say what the prospects for success with geoengineering through solar radiation management are. But one of the things that's clear is that solar radiation management has no impact at all on CO2 concentrations, and the acidification of the oceans is a direct consequence of these CO2 emissions. It's really dramatic how the changes in ocean chemistry as a consequence of acidification change the prospects for important ocean communities, including coral reefs. And let me just start by showing this plot from Ken Caldera's group, where the purple dots are the current distributions of warm water corals. And you can see that essentially all of the warm water corals occur where the saturation ratio for aragonite, this is essentially the carbonate concentration in the water, is up in the range of 3 to 5. And the aragonite saturation level is easy to predict from the CO2 level in the atmosphere, and you don't have to take the CO2 level up very far to move a lot of these coral communities out of the range where they have optimum levels of skeleton-forming materials. Here you can see that by the time we reach 450 parts per million, which is more or less the level that's required for 2 degrees of warming, that most of these warm water corals, you can see through here, are now out of the area that's considered optimal for coral reef formation. So we really don't have very far to go in terms of CO2 concentrations before we're beginning to pick up really consequential impacts across the biosphere, and particularly in the ocean biosphere. A final component of the climate dilemma that I want to talk about is illustrated here. Most people know, Arrhenius knew in 1896, that if you release an aliquot of CO2 to the atmosphere, sooner or later that's going to partition between the atmosphere and the oceans, with about 80% of it going into the oceans over 100 years and about 20% staying in the atmosphere for a really, really long time, hundreds and hundreds of years. But what a number of papers have shown recently, including this one, which is also from my colleague Ken Caldera's lab, is that if you release a pulse of CO2 to the atmosphere and it goes into the oceans over, this is a simulation over 500 years, the temperature doesn't go down over the same time that the CO2 concentration goes down. Essentially, what happens, and this has now been replicated in many studies, is that as the CO2 concentration goes down, the ability of the oceans to remove heat from the atmosphere also goes down, essentially in parallel, so that the warming that we encounter as a result of the CO2 pulse needs to be understood as essentially permanent, at least permanent on this millennial time scale. That's another motivation to think about negative emissions technologies, because we need to understand that removal of CO2 from the atmosphere at the rate that the ocean does it doesn't solve the climate problem even over a many centuries time scale. Let me just pause here. Is everybody kind of with the storyline so far? Any questions about where we are with the carbon cycle? Elton.
Chris, an unbelievably basic question that maybe belongs back in your definition page of a billion tons of carbon versus a billion tons of CO2. When you talk about 2 degrees, are you talking about land temperatures or global average mean? translating the 2 degrees into in the Central Valley or in the Arctic North? Because 2 degrees just doesn't sound that bad.
Well, that's so let me just say two things. What I should have said I was going to do all the temperatures in centigrade, and remember that 1 degree centigrade is 1.8 Fahrenheit. So the 2 centigrade is 3.6 Fahrenheit, and the 2 degree standard that was adopted as a result of the Copenhagen Agreement is generally conceived as 2 degrees over pre-industrial. In the Working Group 1 IPCC report that was released last week, they were a little equivocal about the warming since the pre-industrial, but the best estimate based on a linear regression is we're about 0.9 C above pre-industrial now. So between now and the 2 C target, we really only have one more. And the other thing that is directly relevant to your point is that overall, a good back-of-the-envelope number is that the land warms twice as much as the oceans. So when we're looking at a global 2C, 70% of the surface is oceans. So we're looking at close to 4 warming over land. And I didn't put any of the RCP climate simulations on the show here, but in general, twice as much warming over land. In the back. There's a big microphone. It's in my way. Okay. What could we do with carbon if we decided to do negative emissions? It's hard to get rid of these quantities of material. Remember, a billion tons is a cubic kilometer of coal, and so we're talking massive quantities. One of the first things I heard in GCEP is Lynn Orr said that if we were to sequester 1 billion tons of carbon using oil pipelines, we would need to reproduce our current oil and gas infrastructure. So we're talking massive quantities of stuff that need to be moved around if we're going to sequester any reasonable amount, any reasonable fraction of the emissions that have occurred. So as you know, when plants grow, the process of plant growth, essentially removing CO2 from the atmosphere and converting it into plant. If you had a way to not let decomposition return that CO2 to the atmosphere, that would be a way to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere, and that's been the foundation for quite a lot of schemes for carbon dioxide reduction, another flavor of geoengineering. And sometimes people talk about doing that with land plants. Sometimes people talk about doing it with marine biomass. With marine biomass, a lot of the idea has been if there are parts of the ocean that are critically short of one mineral that's not required in very large quantities, you might provide a little bit of that and get a giant amplification on the amount of carbon you could store. That's the whole idea of ocean iron fertilization. We're not going to talk in detail about that, but I should say just in passing that there have been a number of experimental studies where iron has been added to patches of ocean, and it's clear that you get a rapid increase in plant growth and photosynthesis, but the tendency is to also get a rapid increase in the rate at which CO2 is returned to the ocean. So the net amount of storage as a consequence of ocean fertilization seems to be quite small. There are a lot of possibilities for putting mineral CO2 into geological formations, and we'll come back to the details of those. In general, if we're going to remove CO2 from the atmosphere and put it someplace where it's going to remain over geological periods, we're going to need to be either converting it into a mineral or pumping it as a liquid into formations either under the ground or under ocean water. And with ocean water, CO2 is relatively compressible, and at deep enough layers in the ocean, CO2 becomes more dense than water, and there's been a lot of question about whether CO2 that's pumped into deep parts of the ocean would just stay there as essentially a pool of CO2. Other questions about what the environmental consequences of that are. But I should say that we're at the very early stages of understanding the consequences of ocean pumping of CO2, but one thing to remember is that I just talked about the problems with ocean acidification, and if we increase the rate at which we're injecting CO2 into the oceans, we're trading one problem off for another, increasing the rate of ocean acidification. Okay, well, I'm more or less at the end of the material that I want to cover, but I want to leave you with this overview of the current global carbon cycle, because the quantities of fluxes are really the bottom line that we need to use to consider candidates for negative emissions technologies. The core number here in the middle is that current industrial activity is releasing about 9 billion tons of carbon every year to the atmosphere. And that is leading to an increase in atmospheric concentration that is on the order of half as much, about 4 billion tons. And currently the residual, the difference between 9 and 4, is being stored at least temporarily with about 2 billion tons going into the oceans. This is what's acidifying the oceans. And about 3 billion tons is going into increased plant growth on land habitats. And that increase in plant growth is some combination of consequences of longer growing seasons, increases in atmospheric CO2, with CO2 acting as a fertilizer for plant growth, and regrowth of forests in places where they were previously cut down. One of the big concerns in carbon cycle research is whether or not this carbon storage, the 3 billion tons per year in the land and the 2 billion tons per year in the oceans, will continue. There are a couple of other big fluxes in the carbon cycle that people need to be aware of when you start looking at prospects for negative emissions. One important one is this flux of CO2 from the atmosphere in photosynthesis. The atmosphere, the 400 parts per million, is about 800 billion tons of carbon. And on an annual basis, a little more than 100 is taken up in plant growth. But on an annual basis, about as much, 60 from the soil and 60 from plant decomposition, is returned to the atmosphere. Whether or not you have a sink is a consequence of a very small difference between this rate of uptake and the rate of release. The flux into the ocean is also very large. On an annual basis, about 90 billion tons goes into the ocean, and about 90 billion tons comes back out, with the storage being a small difference between two very large numbers. If we can make that difference larger with the input larger than the output, that represents a larger net storage. If it goes the other way, we could have a net release. And one of the big concerns in current thinking about the carbon cycle is where we have large pools of carbon that are essentially vulnerable to rapid release, and that includes large forested areas as well as the massive areas of frozen soils known as permafrost. Just to give you an idea of the scale, the amount of carbon in the world's tropical forests is around 300 billion tons, about a little less than half of what's in the atmosphere. The amount that's in frozen soils at high latitudes is about 2,000 billion tons, or about 2.5 times what's in the atmosphere.
Question there? Go back to that. So could you just say a word on how well calibrated those numbers are? Or sort of put it another way is, which ones are, what's the levels of uncertainty of some of these different numbers? And the reason I ask is certain people make a big thing of, oh, well, the, in and out of the ocean is so big, human stuff doesn't matter.
Right. So the annual increase in the atmosphere is known with very high precision. That's what you measure at Mauna Loa. The amount of emissions from fossil fuels is known with the year-to-year changes are known with quite high precision. There's probably between 2 and 5% uncertainty on the total number, and that's hundreds of millions of tons. But in terms of the year-to-year dynamics, we have pretty good confidence in that. The ocean is the amount of storage in the ocean is known with a relatively high level of certainty, maybe 15% uncertainty on the 2. And the reason that we have such a high level of confidence with that is that the ocean models can be calibrated with a number of very good tracers. The best tracer, unfortunately, is C14 in the atmosphere, which was released as a consequence of nuclear weapons testing. But by watching the rate at which C14 is moved into the ocean, we know a lot about the characteristics of ocean carbon uptake. Historically, this land residual land amount has been calculated as a residual because we haven't had good models for calculating that. We're finally just getting to the point where the model calculations are good enough that we can actually compare them with the number that we get by saying what's left over after everything else. And so I would say that we now have this number down to about also a 20% uncertainty, 20% on the 3. Now, the magnitude of the 120 and the magnitude of the 90 are still quite uncertain. They're probably 15% uncertain, but we know with a very high level of confidence that the difference between the in and the out on the land and the in and the out on the oceans will be at 0 in the long term. Okay, is this where we're switching? Okay, so now you're going to hear about negative emissions from the person who's really
Thanks, Chris. That's a hard act to follow, but let's see. So, Chris talked about these biological stores in the soil briefly here. I just want to highlight a few of the processes that occur here and how little we understand about them, because these represent opportunities for research. And that's the general message that I'd like to relay to you today, is that there's some studies and there's some negative emissions technologies that we know of, but there's little data on them at the moment, and there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding the data that does exist. So I'm going to give you an overview of a few of the technologies and then some of the estimates of capacity, and hopefully along the way I will identify some opportunities for research and see these challenges as just what they should be, as opportunities and not as a deterrent to doing anything, to doing something about it. So as well as these soil stores and the ocean store, there's CO2 sequestration options in geological storage sites. And some of the technologies will depend on that. And the first technology I want to cover is this one, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So can I have a show of hands for how many people are familiar with this technology already? Very few. Okay, great. So then I'll do the comprehensive overview. So the basic concept here is that you co-fire biomass with a fossil fuel, or you can have a dedicated biomass facility. And what happens is you catch the flow stream, so you catch 90% of the CO2 that you release from the fossil fuel, as well as what comes from the biomass when you co-fire it, and then you inject that underground with carbon capture and sequestration. And I will go into more detail about what that will involve later and some of the constraints on that system. But the general idea of how this gets to negative emissions is that the biomass, plants, for example, will capture CO2 through photosynthesis. And as Chris showed you, some of that goes back to the atmosphere and some of it goes into the soil. And so the portion that you are combusting should end up in geological storage for a long period of time. That's the concept. So as well as having the fossil fuel emissions captured, you're also capturing a portion of atmospheric CO2 that those plants have taken up. Does that make sense? Okay, great. Now, there are some limitations to this technology. And one, of course, is the biomass potential. And there are a few studies that have looked at global biomass potential on abandoned lands. And some of these studies that show a reasonable potential for this technology include the use of agricultural residues and wastes, as well as these dedicated bioenergy crops, which have the potential to reach high yields. But as well as the availability of biomass, there's the proximity that you have to think about, the proximity of your biomass to your fossil fuel plant, as well as the proximity of that to a geological storage site. So actually one more important thing to point out is that you get some kind of energy supply from this system, hopefully electricity. And so BECCS is kind of in its infancy. I guess the components of the system have been looked at to some degree, but as far as I'm aware, there's only a couple of projects that are actually operating, and I think numbers 1 and 2, if you can make them out here on this slide. around here are currently operating. Just exactly what they're doing, I don't know. And some of these other ones are under construction, and some have actually been decommissioned. So there's something going on in the area, but it's not exactly clear how far along it is or how it will progress. So another, yes, question.
On the carbon capture and storage, is that the same technology and approaches would be used for coal plants today?
Yeah, exactly. And I will talk in a bit more depth about that and some of the potential limitations as far as we understand for now and as far as my knowledge has. I'll share that with you. So another potentially negative emissions technology that makes use of biomass is this one to make biochar. And the idea here is that you treat the biomass in a low oxygen environment, a certain temperature and pressure, and that's the slow pyrolysis. You can also do different methods, fast pyrolysis, that gives you different amounts of these. And the idea is that you're left with a carbon-rich part called biochar, and then you put that back in the ground. And there's a lot of literature on biochar and its effects, and some are good effects and some maybe not so good. And a lot of it has to do with the composition of the biomass, the type of soil that you're putting it in, and the environmental conditions. And so sometimes it can act as a carbon store for a fairly long time, and it can also act as a fertilizer, and it can also have water retaining capacity. And in other cases, it actually does nothing for plant productivity, and carbon is emitted. So there's a lot of room for research and understanding just the kind of role biochar could play globally and in a site-specific manner. And so this also will give you some energy supply here. You have the potential to make syngas and to make these other products. And so both of these technologies require a biomass supply. And so this is a study by Chris Field and his folks, actually, that shows the potential for perennial species on abandoned land. And this is net primary production estimates. And I want to just draw your attention to these parts here. So this is the potential. The blue areas are higher than the yellow for production. And so there's some areas where you could potentially have a fair amount of biomass energy crop types in the world, but there's other areas where it's really slim. And this compares the primary energy demand for that region with the bioenergy that you could produce there. And you can see some areas far exceed their demands, but other areas it's below their demand. But what I really want to highlight here is that there's some areas where it might make sense to use different technologies over others. So for example, with developing countries, you know, it could make sense with the available biomass to make a biochar if you understand what it's going to do in those circumstances. There's also, I will show later, a map of potential geological sequestration sites, and some of those geological sequestration sites overlap potentially with some of these areas where we can have reasonable productivity. But this is a very high level, and we need to do a lot more granular analysis on it. This study looks at biochar feedstocks, and it estimated with very optimistic parameters what kind of impact biochar could have on avoiding emissions. And they looked at a number of different types of biomass. Rice is here, sugarcane, biomass crops, forest residues. And these are just different scenarios. This is moderate, ambitious, and extreme. So this is the maximum sustainable potential. So it's assuming you take more of a certain residue than you would in these other scenarios. And really, I just want to highlight that you get avoided emissions from many things here. You get it avoided from methane decomposition that would normally happen in rice. And you get it from the biochar being in the soil. And the overarching thing from this is really that 50% of the avoided emissions are from the biochar being stored in the soil. 30% is from fossil fuel offsets, and then about 20% is from the offset of these methane emissions and nitrous oxide. So there's some potential here. I think this estimated it could offset about 1.8 gigatons per year, but I think that might be ambitious. So taking a slightly different tack now, this technologies, direct air capture or artificial trees, does not use biomass, doesn't require biomass. And this is, I guess there's some estimates on the potential of this, and all I really want to say about this is that this can be a passive process here, but the desorption of the CO2 requires quite a lot of energy in fresh water, and then there's a requirement for carbon capture and storage here. And these are a couple of other methods, and all of these are in this Grantham report. They did a nice analysis, and they do state there's a lot of caveats to this assessment. A lot of the assessment, they could only find a couple of literature resources for that, and the cost estimates and deployment scale potential is highly uncertain. But all I want to say about these really is that there are these other options, but they all here require carbon capture and sequestration because you use a fossil fuel input to heat this calcination kiln to make it so that it absorbs CO2 over here as well. So this is their output of their analysis, and it's an estimate of energy, raw materials, and capital costs for each of these technologies. And I just want to convey a qualitative overview of what these technologies could potentially do. If you see, think about this is 0.1 parts per million per year CO2. So think about how much you'd have to scale up these. This is how much equipment you would need, how many trees you would need to take out 0.1 parts per million CO2 per year. And then for the biochar, how many units, and then for the BECCS facility and the costs. And so if you multiply this up by, say, like 30, I think that's how much we would have to remove, you're talking more than 1 million trees, right? So actually that's already 0.23 times 60 million trees, right? So the scale is massive for what we think we would need to do. This is another analysis, and if you'll notice, this is where you can see a lot of the uncertainty actually in these studies already, because the costs for this direct air capture artificial trees here is $95 per ton of CO2 equivalents. And this one estimates, that these direct air capture methods would be more than $200 per ton. A lot of variability in these. What I want to get across here is this is the annual requirement, and this is not on this scale here, but it just gives you the bubble size is the capacity that is needed. And these are the capacity of each of the technologies potentially that was found from this study. And then along this axis here, the readiness, which is the technology readiness level. At about 5, it means that the components of the system have been validated, but there's a need for a pilot scale or systems validation. And BECCS falls under there, and biochar falls under there. Forestry has a higher technology readiness. And then biomass and construction can look quite attractive. But these others are further down here. The capacity might be greater, but they're further away from being deployed in a technology sense. So now I just want to talk a little bit about carbon capture and sequestration, because you'll notice, if you noticed, how many of those technologies I talked about needed CCS. So I talked about 5 technologies, and how many needed CCS? 4, exactly. Good job. So with that in mind, so I'll put this out there, unless you find another use for the CO2, some other way to fix it and make something else useful out of it. So I just want to talk briefly about what carbon capture, dioxide, CO2 capture and sequestration is, and then hopefully from this you'll see just what things need to be looked at for it to make it possible with biomass, or what things need to be done to make it possible with fossil fuels as well. So this method, there's basically 4 steps: and capture, compression, pipeline transport, and geological sequestration. And I won't go into a great deal of detail about these. There's a lot of folks around Stanford in previous tutorials who talked on carbon capture and other things. And Sally Benson, this is her field. So if you have any particular questions about a particular aspect, then I would direct you to her. But capture and compression for this process needs about 10 to 40% more energy than the equivalent plant without capture. And that depends on the type of system, of course, but 10 to 40% more energy. So that's a consideration just for CCS, not with biomass added. But potentially, you can co-fire biomass with fossil fuel. There's some limitations to that. There's a particle size and all kinds of physical things that you have to think about, the content of the biomass feedstock. And also the scale. If we think about most biomass facilities, they're a much smaller scale than a lot of fossil fuel plants. So you'd have to think about that if you were to do it, because a lot of these things, as you'll see later, are scale dependent. The costs of CCS are highly scale dependent. Now, potentially, there's no reason that you can't co-fire biomass or put biomass into any of these processes, which are the common processes for fossil fuels. With each one, you have to think about fireside issues like corrosion and things, and some biomass feedstocks will give you bigger issues than others. For example, the good crops, the energy crops, some of them are high in potassium, and that forms potassium chloride, which is highly corrosive. So there's other things you have to think about, ash formation, pollutants, and so you might need some system, additional system that you don't have with the fossil fuel as is. So that's the conversion. What about the transportation of the CO2? Well, this is the existing and planned CO2 pipeline network in the US, according to this study. And currently, 50 million tons a year are transported. And so the dotted lines represent planned pipelines, and the solid ones are existing pipelines. So there's some, but it's not countrywide, and so that's a consideration. You have to think about where your biomass is grown, and does that coincide with, good weather conditions where you need few inputs, and does that coincide with a facility for conversion, and then the pipeline and the storage site. So as I mentioned earlier, there's massive economies of scale with the transport of CO2. And this shows you that, the bigger the diameter of pipe, the cheaper it is. And, here is 30 centimeters. There's still a foot. That's quite a big pipe still. But that's when you're starting to get to lower costs. So with the transportation, the key issues are probably that it's just highly scale dependent. You get large returns of scale, and if you're going to do BECCS, you probably need to piggyback on an existing infrastructure for carbon capture and sequestration of fossil fuels. So what about the storage capacity? Is it limiting? Not really. This shows you sites that are highly prospective, the darker areas here, and then the lighter gray prospective sites. And you can see there's quite a large distribution around the globe, but it's not everywhere. And this is just some numbers on that. And this is a log plot. So, this is a site that has the capacity to store 1 billion tons of CO2. And this is like 1,000 billion tons of CO2, right? And there's different formations you can put this in. Saline formations are really quite impressive in Brazil and North America. And then there's the option for depleted oil and gas reservoirs and coal seams. So globally, if you're to add up all these numbers, it's not really limiting to how much we're talking about that we would want to do to get to negative emissions. So with the capacity being there, there's still some other things to think about. You have to characterize your site well enough so you don't get leaks. You have to think about making injection wells and monitoring. And these costs, it's really highly scale dependent. So if you want to put a small amount of CO2 underground, you're still going to have to do all of these things. So the more the better in the same place. And with BECCS, you're limited unless you have some kind of piggyback on this fossil fuel. So to summarize, all of these parts for BECCS are influenced by scale, are dependent on scale. And so one of the major things with BECCS would be global biomass supply. I think that's one of the major limiting factors, as well as having the infrastructure there to deal with it. Thinking about transportation distances and storage sites and the proximity of those to each other. And I think with that, it's time to hand it over to Chris. So, yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I did have a quick question. I have to admit, maybe I just missed it. The first time I've seen coal seams as a potential storage thing. Say some more, but the reason I ask is, having grown up in western Pennsylvania, there often were methane fires, in old coal mines and stuff, so that made me a little nervous.
Yeah, so actually,
So where's that from?
Lynn Orr is probably a great person for you to talk with. He's done a lot of work on coal fires and coal bed stuff, but I don't know too much about the logistics of that and how often fires occur and that kind of thing, but
I wouldn't worry about the depleted oil wells or the saline aquifers, but the coal seams made me nervous, that's all.
yeah, maybe rightly so, I don't know.
Methane and CO2 both stick to coal, and there's been a lot of coal bed methane development. So putting CO2 back in there means that you're less likely to get a fire, potentially. So let me just summarize a couple aspects of the things that Jenny already told you about. It. Those of you who were at David Lobel's talk this morning heard him say that based on the approach that we took in our GCEP research, we think there might be on the order of a billion tons of carbon per year of sustainably harvested biomass that would be available on the worldwide scale if we thought about biomass harvesting that was done in a environmentally sustainable way, where we weren't going into food production areas, not going into forested areas. If we were able to capture 100% of that in a biomass energy and carbon capture and storage system, that would represent order of 10% of current global emissions, and would mean that we would be, if we got emissions down to zero, we might remove atmospheric CO2 at a rate of about 0.5 part per million per year. It's not a panacea. And at least if the range of technologies that's available to us are limited to this sustainable domain of biomass production, it's a modest increment to our technology portfolio. But if there's a single message I've taken away from all of my experience with GCEP, it's that there's no single technology that really solves the climate problem, and 0.5 ppm per year removal of CO2 from the atmosphere is a big player in a multiplayer environment. My sense is that the opportunities for exploring these carbon negative energy technologies should be regarded as really, really attractive, but really far from providing a comprehensive single-step solution to the climate challenge. Let me just talk about a couple of other technologies and do a little bit of final stage setting as we open up for a more general discussion. So the first is that there are a number of proposals out there for technologies to convert CO2 in the atmosphere into rocks. And, you know, on the very long time scale, on the time scale of tens of millions of years, it's the balance between weathering that decomposes carbonate minerals and that decomposes silicate minerals that establishes the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. And there's been a lot of work invested in whether there are technologies by which we might take these reactions that occur over tens of millions of years and make them occur over years or decades in order to dramatically increase the rate at which the reactions occur, and we can basically build new rocks. The real challenge there is that, as far as we can tell, the key to accelerating the pace of the reactions is to have the silicate rocks ground up really fine. I don't know how many of you do rock grinding on the weekend, but it's really hard. It takes a lot of energy to grind up the silicate rocks, and so we haven't really figured out a way to have the carbon sequestration potential in enhanced weathering be a big part of the energy picture without putting a whole bunch of extra energy in. And I mean, when you look across all these biomass technologies too, the real fly in the ointment is that deploying most of the technologies takes vast amount of energy, and it's really difficult to have your deployment efficient enough so that you're not ending up using almost as much energy to do the strategy as you end up offsetting with your increased storage. And with biomass, that's particularly challenging because biomass tends to occur on the landscape at such low densities. In principle, you can imagine that if you have to drive 20 feet to the next corn stalk, the gasoline required to get to the corn stalk can be as much as the energy in the corn stalk that you sequester. So finding ways to have the transportation energy, the compression energy, and the processing energy be really minimal is a great breakthrough. One of the reasons that the biomass energy with carbon capture and storage is so much more attractive than the direct air capture using the artificial trees that Jenny talked about is that with normal smokestack gases are about 10% CO2 as opposed to 0.04% in the air. And if you do oxycombustion, you can have 100% CO2 as opposed to 0.04% in the air. And this gigantic concentration of the CO2 makes the energetic requirements for doing the capture, compression, and pumping much less. So what are the things we need to really think about as we evaluate each of the negative emissions technologies? And I think the first one, the most important one that I already talked about in the context of how much sustainably available biomass there is the potential of each of the pathways. And in a multi-component portfolio, we don't want to overlook individual strategies just because they're modest in scale, but we also want to recognize the modesty in scale, and the evidence that's available to date indicates that none of these negative emissions technologies are going to rise to the level of being major dominant components of the carbon budget or of the energy system. You know, one of the things that I think we've really done made a lot of contributions in GCEP is helping the global community understand the risk of unintended environmental consequences or climate consequences from deployment of alternative energy technologies, especially biomass energy. And David Lobel talked about this morning in his comments. With carbon capture and storage added to biomass energy, we pick up an additional set of concerns related to seismic stability that get added on top of the issues with competition with food or with biological diversity. I should say that the overall agenda of the safety of geological storage is one that's proceeding rapidly, and GCEP's made a lot of progress in this area. My personal feeling is that with carbon capture and geological sequestration, the issues don't look so serious that they don't warrant further research. And if you ask me about almost any kind of energy technology, that's what I'll tell you, because the needs for alternative energy are so great. Really difficult to see which of these are going to be cost competitive. Certainly at this point, there are no negative emissions technologies that look economically attractive, but that's because, as Prime Minister Brundtland described yesterday, we really haven't got the prices right, and in particular, we're not pricing the environmental damages that are associated with the climate changes. Once we do this, it's likely that we'll see an increasing motivation for deploying some of these technologies, even though they're likely to continue to be at the expensive end. The reason they're likely to be attractive, even though they're expensive, is that this is a unique subset of the energy technologies with the potential to result in decreased atmospheric CO2 at the same time they're injecting energy into the energy system. And then it is really important to not overlook the fact that there are a whole bunch of alternatives that we could consider that in simple terms might be regarded as a get-out-of-jail-free card. And certainly that's one of the major issues with geoengineering through solar radiation management schemes. And I think it's really important to note that pretty much everything we've said about these negative emissions technologies is that they could be consequential, useful parts of an overall aggressive renewable energy portfolio, but they're certainly not likely to be available at a scale where one would view them as decreasing the motivation for rapid action on climate-forcing gases. So the issue of moral hazard and the idea of a get-out-of-jail-free card needs to be discussed, but I think that, well, unfortunately, I guess we're not safe with these technologies because they don't have the potential to really to solve the problem in and of themselves. But it is really important as we look at a wide range of renewable energy technologies to recognize that with almost all these technologies, there are huge benefits for early action, and that the idea of delaying usually results in making the problem so much more complicated that the costs increase dramatically. Even with these negative emissions technologies, there'd be huge cost savings that are associated from doing the research soon enough that we can deploy them at the time that we decide they become necessary, which could be very, very soon in the future. And then a final simulation that I want to leave you with is, how difficult is it to achieve the 2-degree target and aggressive mitigation level of this 2.6 watts per meter squared of forcing at the end of the century without BECCS, without some kind of negative emissions? And what the simulation shows here is that depending on when you start, it looks really, really expensive to do it without negative emissions. Another way to understand this problem is that if you ask all of the integrated assessment models to solve for an energy system that produces this 2-degree world at the end of the century with or without BECCS, biomass energy with carbon capture and storage, about half of them can't do it at all, and the other half can only do it with BECCS in the system. Essentially, none of the models can conceive of an economy that produces this 2.6 watts per meter squared of total forcing at the end of the century without biomass energy and carbon capture. So let me just leave with an overview of where we are in terms of emissions, including emissions from gases other than CO2. I started out by saying that, roughly speaking, at the global scale, you can think of our CO2 budget as being a quarter transportation, a quarter making stuff, a quarter residential buildings, and a quarter of commercial buildings. This is a more detailed listing, and it in particular includes the really large carbon footprint that's associated with agriculture, both agricultural byproducts and land use and biomass burning. Until about 1950, emissions from deforestation were larger than fossil fuel emissions, and they still constitute 10 to 15% of total CO2 emissions. The other thing that's really important to recognize when we think about emissions budgets, and especially negative emissions going forward, is that CO2 emissions are still the largest quantitatively in terms of climate forcing, but there are other important climate forcers, including methane and nitrous oxide, ozone and chlorofluorocarbons are also important. And I think the final graph, I guess I don't have a plot of each of these, but the climate forcing due to all of these other gases is now up to about a third of the total climate forcing from greenhouse gases that are produced by human activities. And we've only begun to scratch the surface of how we might do negative emissions with some of these other gases. And I think it's important that we recognize that there's going to be some opportunities here and some real ripe situations for further research. At this point, what I'd like to do is I'd like to throw it open for a general discussion, but I want to leave you with the message that we're on a trajectory where, like it or not, we're setting ourselves up to need negative emissions technologies. We don't have a clear pathway to the deployment of those technologies, but there are some promising starting points that are coupled with some really massive technology and energy balance challenges. If I were to say what's the take-home message from today's material, it's that the best way to solve the climate problem is to cut emissions so aggressively that we don't need to deploy these negative emissions technologies. But if we do, I think we should be prepared to deal with them. We should be prepared to recognize what their limitations are. Let me open it now for discussion, and Jenny I assume, will be happy to come up here and help answer questions. So thank you very much. Questions?
While ethanol is currently practiced, be considered positive or negative emissions?
You want to answer? Well, you know, Jenny showed a map of where carbon capture and storage associated with biomass energy is currently deployed, and the only deployments in the U.S. are biomass ethanol plants where the CO2 that's released as a product of the ethanol refining is captured and pumped into underground storage. So when you make liquid fuels, you kind of come up with a half in, half out type of situation in which half of the CO2 ends up in the ethanol, and that comes out the tailpipe of the cars. And the other half, the half that was basically used in the refining process, potentially gets captured at the smokestack and sequestered in the geological formations. And so it's not carbon negative, but it's not as carbon positive as it would be otherwise. So actually, let me restate. It can be carbon negative. It depends on how much fossil input, because the CO2 that's in the biomass came from the atmosphere. If you only return half of it back, you're still carbon negative. Most ethanol processing still involves significant inputs of natural gas, so whether it comes out to be carbon negative in any particular situation depends on the efficiency of that particular factory.
I might just add that how you get the biomass and what land use change and harvesting, that whole portion also makes a big difference to your end net CO2 result. So there's some studies that show that you can swing it, it's like 60% of the emissions from the life cycle of some biomass is associated with just that harvesting part. So, you could definitely swing it either more positive or more negative, but it depends on the type of biomass, the land that was there before, the land use, and then how you manage the land. So, for example, if you're to burn on the land, you're going to go way positive. But if you plant species on abandoned land that have extensive root systems, then potentially you could sequester more carbon in that part of the process as well. So there's different ways to swing it more negative or more positive. And the thing with ethanol as well is there's one thing that's better than that than with co-firing biomass. There might be more, but one that comes to mind is you have a relatively pure stream of CO2 from the fermentation process. So if you think about what you don't need in that case.
So a comment on your summary comment, the talk this morning about transportation. And if we're really realistic that liquid transportation fuels will be at about 100 million barrels a day still in 2030 by EIA estimates. So if we're realistic, pessimistic, My quick back of the envelope says that we'll need almost exactly about 0.5 parts per million CO2 capture to offset that. So I think if we're still down this road and we don't capture CO2 from vehicles, so we'll absolutely need something like this, and we ought to start it yesterday if we're still on this liquid transportation and no way to shut that down. But building on your earlier graph, if we're adding 2 parts per million CO2 to the atmosphere every year right now, and it's going to get a little bit worse before it gets anywhere near better, how is it that we could stay below, say, 440 ppm by the end of 2040? You know, just some simple arithmetic, 20 years and 2 ppm. Is there optimistic thinking?
Well, Prime Minister Brundtland is here, and she may want to comment on this. I mean, so I've been a student of the carbon cycle for many years, and during that time, I've seen annual emissions basically double during the time I've been studying it. And during that whole time, we've been talking about how aggressively we need to decrease them. So it's not a lack of knowledge about the need to decrease. It's a lack of the political will to begin putting solutions in place. I mean, a lot of the reason my thinking has drifted over toward these negative emissions technologies is that I do believe that we're going to decide that we should have been more aggressive, and there aren't very many ways you can go back and fix errors of judgment. This is one. It's not a get-out-of-jail-free card, but it really does have some potential. Prime Minister Brundtland, do you want to comment on this, what you think the prospects are?
I can just say I agree with what you said. I mean, that's why one has to keep these things in mind, because we are not going to manage early enough.
Yeah.
There's one in the back. Evan? Yeah.
In the argument for divestment from the fossil fuel companies, the argument has been that these companies have in their reserves 5 times as much carbon CO2 potential as we can afford to emit. And therefore, the drive is tell them to keep 80% of it in the ground. I've looked at those numbers, and it seems to me that it's assumed that all of the emissions would end up in the atmosphere, moving us toward the 2 degrees C. It looks to me from your numbers that about half it doesn't get to the atmosphere. And therefore, it's only, say, 2.5 times as much as we can afford to emit. Have you looked at that issue?
Well, a safe assumption, you know, the amount of accessible fossil fuel reserves has been going up as the technologies for accessing materials has gotten better and better. Not speaking to the amount that's economically accessible, but just total amount of fossil reserves in the accessible parts of the Earth crust are probably around 6,000 billion tons. And from the beginning of the industrial era until now, we've released about 500 billion tons of carbon to the atmosphere. And most of the estimates are that for a 50% chance of staying below 2C, we have a cumulative budget of not more than about 1,000 billion tons, 1 trillion tons. And that was the conclusion from the IPCC report that was released last week. So that represents about 1/6 of the total fossil reserves. I believe that the recent estimates of economically recoverable reserves, which are, as I said, have been changing dramatically, are at about 3 times that 1,000. So it is certainly the case that the currently economically viable fossil reserves are larger than what you can think about the planet's lifetime carbon budget by a substantial amount. On the other hand, if we are going to make progress with any of these negative emissions technologies that involve geological sequestration, the kinds of enterprises that have the technology to do that are the big fossil fuel companies. And without commenting particularly on the divestment agenda, it would be great to have companies aggressively investing in the technology to do CO2 capture and storage if we're going to be able to deploy these. Mm-hmm.
It seems like from this, the scientific and technological white space would be in doing something else with the CO2 other than sequestration. So can you comment on if GCEP has an RFP out on that, and the organizations have an RFP out on that?
Yeah, we have a few projects that we funded in that without actually having an RFP in that area. And some of the folks are at this conference, like Dan Stack, Bob Weymouth, Chris Chitsey, Tom Jaramillo, and all those folks in their groups are doing CO2 to fuels and ways to fix carbon dioxide into other things that are useful. So a lot of catalysis work and ligand work and stuff like that. So we funded those, I think last year or the year before. So we have started an area of the portfolio that includes projects like that. It's fundamental science. You know, it's still a ways away from being anything that's scalable as far as I know. I think there's some industry doing or claiming to do stuff like that, but I don't know the details of it. So.
Yeah, of course, doing something else with CO2 is what photosynthesis is and a lot of the GCEP investments have been in alternative chemical approaches to making CO2 into organic compounds. And there are also things like the Calera effort to make CO2 into concrete, given the availability of the alkalinity. Other questions, comments? John?
So actually back to the thing about sort of divestment of fossil fuel companies and what roles they can play. A thing that always worries me a little bit is lumping all the fossil fuel companies together in any of these. I mean, because it's always seemed to me there was a break between the oil and gas guys and the coal guys in terms of how useful they can be, what technologies.
Good point. Yeah, you don't see very many deep drilling and pumping operations in the coal companies.
You mentioned that adding a carbon capture system to a power plant increases the operating energy cost by like 40% or something?
Between a 10 and 40%, yeah.
What fraction is that energy cost of the energy output of the plant, approximately?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. Sally Benson probably be able to give you an answer. But I mean, you have $1 per ton cost on CO2, but I don't know what the fraction of the overall cost of the plant actually. Yeah.
Are you talking about the capital cost of the plant or the actual just energy penalty?
Operating.
I want to know how much energy it costs to run.
Yeah. I mean, that's in general when they talk about the 10 to 40%, that's the energy penalty.
Right.
So that if you, for every gigawatt you generate, you have to use 100 megawatts to do the compression and pumping. Well, if it's 10%.
Right.
Okay, well, we'll be around. Thank you guys so much.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.